forwarded, and we will translate it into Spanish and upload it into our YouTube later on. So we're going to start this event here at the SB56, Loss and Damage in Latin America, Community Perspectives. The idea of this event, it's a little bit to try to explain or share our experiences as Latin Americans from either our research or personal experience. How is loss and damage playing out in our communities and our region? As you all know, loss and damage is an issue that even yesterday the IPCC was saying that is already here. It's impacting our communities. It is impacting in an economic and non-economic way. And I think Adriana is going to share a little bit also how psychological trauma in terms of what loss and damage does to people in communities, something that is even manifesting now, is something that we should take on account. And at the same time, while we know it's something that is very present, something that is affecting the communities that are in the most vulnerable conditions, here at the UNFCCC, we still do not have any funding to address loss and damage. Governments are unable to even include it as a permanent agenda item. So while it is part of the Paris Agreement that is included in Article 8, and it's supposed to be the third pillar of the Paris Agreement, and it's an issue that has been talked to since the creation of the UNFCCC. It's a political demand that has been there. It's a scientific fact that exists. It is not properly addressed by governments. And that does not mean that there is not a response from communities. Communities are paying already the cost of loss and damage. So the fact that there is not a political or an agenda item at the UNFCCC or a financial facility does not mean that the negative externalities of climate change are not paid by someone, and are paid by women, are paid by communities in vulnerable community, are paid in terms of lives lost, in terms of language, culture, crops, styles of living, well-being, and even the prospects of a future in terms of having an identity as a people and a future in your land. And to sort of tackle this issue and explore it, we have today with me Nafkote Davi from OXFAM. We're also joined by Adriana Vasquez from La Ruta del Clima, Ingrid Hausinger from the Heinrich Boll Foundation, and she's online. And eventually, hopefully, we'll be joined by Nasha Cubelier from Sustentabilidad Sin Fronteras in Argentina, and Bernice Trejos from the Centro Nicaraguense de Conservación Nicaragua, which is an NGO based in Nicaragua in Central America. So after my long introduction, I'm going to give the mic to Nafkote, so go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. So I'm going to talk today about two things. First, I want to talk about the climate crisis from the point of inequality, or within the lens of inequality, because the climate crisis is about inequality and injustice. And it also helps us, I think, understand better. And, when we're talking about solution for loss and damage, I think it's really important to understand that inequality is, at the heart of the climate crisis. Yeah, so that's what I covered. So I will talk about climate inequality in terms of three areas. One is in terms of emissions. I know we all know about this, but I really want to emphasize inequality in terms of emissions, inequality in terms of impact, and inequality in terms of, how do countries respond when there's a climate crisis, and also beyond recovery. And then the second part, of course, is loss and damage, and I will spend a bit of time on that as well. So, emissions inequality. I think for us, it's really important to understand about this so that we can also assign responsibility to the, who is responsible for the climate crisis, because it's also linked to how can we find solution to this. So we are not all equally responsible for the climate crisis, and I'm sure in this room, and also people who are logged in online, I think we're on the same page when it comes to this. We are not all equally responsible for the climate crisis. It's the richest countries and the richest people that are largely responsible for the climate crisis. And I think it's important to be clear about this. So global north countries are responsible for 92% of excess emissions and hence for 92% of climate damages. This is looking, of course, at cumulative historical emissions as well as per capita emissions. And when we look at per capita emissions, really important to understand, it helps us understand better, who's responsible, again, for the climate crisis. It's the richest people that are largely responsible for the climate crisis. Just the richest 1% of the world's population are responsible for more than twice the carbon emissions of 50% of the world's poorest. When we're talking about the world's poorest, we're talking about, over 3 billion people. So again, really important to emphasize that we're not all equally responsible for the climate crisis. It's the richest people and the richest countries. So when it comes to impact, again, I'm sure we all know that we're not impacted equally. Yeah? We all like to think we're in this crisis together. And yes, it's a nice feeling. And also it creates solidarity. But it's important to underline, it's the poorest people that are impacted most. And it's the poorest people, actually, who have contributed least to the climate crisis, that are paying the highest price. So again, we're not all impacted equally. Here, I want to give an example. When Dominica, Hurricane Maria happened in 2017, the damage caused was equivalent to 225% of Dominica's GDP. Then 2020, there was a flooding in Germany, and it was a huge flooding. But the damage caused is equivalent to 0.1% of Germany's GDP. And Germany is a rich country. And the damage to their economy was 0.1%, when Dominica, what they experienced was 225% of their GDP. So this is to show, when it comes to impact as well, we're not equally impacted. I think I've said this, it's the poorest, those least responsible, that are impacted the most. And then even amongst those, women, people of color, indigenous communities, historically marginalized people are the hardest hit and most impacted by the climate crisis. When we also, so we've talked about inequality in emissions, inequality in impact. Now, inequality in response and recovery. There's also inequality in how we respond to a crisis or how we adapt to it. We all don't have the same capacity to respond, technically, and financial capacity. Finance is required to adapt to a changing climate, and I think the IPCC has made it clear, climate change is here, and we have to adapt to the changing climate, and poor countries especially need finance to adapt to what's happening. So countries and communities need to adapt. The poorest countries are impacted the most. They are also experiencing damages and losses at the same time. So the climate crisis is eroding actually the little capacity they have. And this is something we really need to emphasize as civil society, that communities, the little they have, they're losing it. And it's going to happen because IPCC has also made it clear that impacts from the climate crisis is going to continue, and countries and communities are going to continue to experience damages and losses. So in order to address the climate crisis, we need to tackle inequality. We need to tackle emissions of the richest people and then emissions of the richest countries as well. So now to loss and damage. So what do we mean when we say loss and damage? Mitigation and adaptation are no longer enough. Irreversible and existential impacts on vulnerable communities and countries across the globe are no longer avoidable. And the recent IPCC report, again, has made this clear. Even if we limit warming, so now there's negotiation on mitigation, yeah? Even if we limit warming, climate vulnerable countries will continue to experience damages and losses as a result of the climate crisis. So you cannot adapt to a sinking climate, to a sinking island. You'll be forced to migrate. Loss and damage is also, when impacts increasingly exceed our abilities to adapt. And it's also beyond humanitarian response. The reason I'm mentioning humanitarian response here is during the negotiation, some countries like the EU and so on, some countries and regions mentioned humanitarian response as a solution to loss and damage, but this is beyond humanitarian response. So OXFAM today, we released a report on loss and damage, and one of our findings is, extreme weather events have been increasing, of course, in the past 30 years, and as a result, also the need for, to address this crisis has been increasing. So funding needed for climate disasters has risen more than 800% in 20 years. So the humanitarians are also overstretched. So this is beyond their capacity to address the issues of loss and damage. So when negotiators tell us, we're providing finance for humanitarian, which can also apply to loss and damage, like we really have to push back on that. I want to talk a bit about Somalia, or the Horn of Africa crisis that's happening right now. I hope all of you are aware of this. Millions of people are at the brink of starvation. Pastoralist communities have lost tens of millions of their livestock. 60 to 70% of their cattle, and that is a conservative estimate, they have lost it. This is their way of life, and to be honest, not a lot of people care about this or what's happening to the pastoralist communities. But this is happening because of La Niña, together with climate change, having a huge impact in the Horn of Africa. So when we're talking about loss and damage, it's about the loss of lives, it's about the loss of livelihoods, it's also about the loss of culture and identity. So how do we make progress? The reason I talked about inequality at the beginning, as I said, it's really important to understand, at the heart of the climate crisis, it's about injustice and inequality, and we need to tackle that. And so climate solutions should be based on justice and fairness. And the idea of justice and fairness is reflected in the UNFCCC. In the UNFCCC, there's the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So there's a recognition that rich countries are largely responsible for the climate crisis, and that rich countries also need to provide finance, technical support, and so on to developing countries so that they can adapt, so that they can address issues of loss and damage, and so that they can address or overcome the climate crisis. But that's not what we're seeing in reality. Yeah? These negotiations have been going for years and years, and the impact on communities is devastating, and this is going to get worse. And the reason I gave the example of Somalia is to emphasize the point, right now, a huge community within the Horn of Africa is impacted. Who's going to respond, or who's going to address that crisis? Who's going to pay for it? So I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nafkote. And I guess with this broad overview of what's loss and damage now, we turn ourselves also to have a little bit of context worldwide into Central America. And for that, we have Ingrid Hausinger, that is based in El Salvador, from the Heinrich Boll Foundation. And so, Ingrid, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you, Adrian, and also thank you for the invitation. So I was thinking whether I can bring new to the table and how to face loss and damages, to talk about loss and damages. And I remember Patricia Castañeda, which is an anthropologist and feminist from Mexico that I like a lot. And she recommends always to approach a subject with 3 steps. So I'm going to try to structure my talk in these 3 steps. So first of all, as a feminist, we always clear from where we speak. And as you said, I'm based in Central America. I'm from El San Salvador. I'm a cis woman. I'm an ecofeminist. I'm a mother. I live in the city. I live in a very secure house. I have a middle income. I have a car. And I have the luxury to go to the work with bicycle if I want to. I have enough money to buy quality food, and I don't have to worry to have food in my table. I have water in my house. So I talk from a lot of privileges. But I live in one of the most vulnerable regions in the world on the effects on climate crisis. I live in El Salvador in Central America, a region where most of the population live at risk, has experienced hunger, and has definitely experienced loss and damages due to climate change. Even I have experienced loss of damages due to climate change. And I also live in a region where the process of colonization and land grabbing and massive extraction of common goods still define the territory and the communities in the territory. We have population in extreme risk and very vulnerable to climate crisis due to this process of colonization. And this is the first step that Patricia Castañeda said that we should always start with. We should always look at the history. We should honor the history of a territory and also the history from the bodies. And so I'm talking about colonization 500 years after it happened in Latin America, because it still marks the territories and the bodies from the people that live in the country. So this is something that we should always have in perspective when we talk about loss and damages, and how the colonization process make the territories from Latin America and the countries in Latin America sacrifice zones that are only there to give for these North markets all the product that they need for their economies and their wealth in the North, in the North or richer countries. And this is one of the points that also is the basis of inequality that was just the colleague from OXFAM talking about. So this is one of the first points that she says that we should start by looking at the history. And the second one that I think is very important when we talk about losses and damages, and we try to approach this subject with respect to the communities that are facing losses and damages, is the one that we should denaturalize or question everything that is established by norm, thinking that the norm has been established from the northern countries that have really not only colonize the territory, but also the way that we think, that we learn, that we measure, or that we value everything, that we put a value to everything, and also even to life. So we have to denaturalize a lot in this conversation about losses and damages. First, we have to denaturalize the idea that losses and damages is avoidable. As you were saying, Adrián, it is not only about the mismanagement or bad governance from our countries. Yes, El Salvador and Central America does not have a very good adaptation plan, and has only come very little forward in the adapting in the territories. But that's not the point, because we cannot adapt to this climate crisis that is coming. There are limits to adaptation, and we have to face this. And we have to face that losses and damages are inevitable, and that the climate crisis is still going to go on, even if we stop polluting or burning fossil fuels. So this is one of the things that we have to denaturalize and stop thinking that we can prevent losses and damages. We have to face them, and we have to find the funding to face losses and damages. And another thing that I think we have to denaturalize is the idea that losses and damages is always linked to an economic value. We have to think about the non-economic losses and damages, and we also have think, and here I speak as an ecofeminist, that we don't want money for the losses that we face in the territory. We don't want money for the losses of human life or the damages in the bodies of the women and the life of the women. We don't want money for that. We want that the polluted countries and the rich countries stop polluting the environment, and we want that our human rights we want to enjoy in fully our human rights, and we don't want to dispute the climate change, or it is very clear that climate change has a negative, profound impact in the human rights, including the right to life, self-determination, development, food, health, etc., or water or sanitation. So there are some things that we cannot put a value on it, and we shouldn't have. That doesn't mean that we don't need the funding to face loss and damages, but we have to remember that not everything has a price, and that we have also to approach with respect and dignity the losses and damages. Another thing that we need to denaturalize is the thing that this idea that we have to measure everything, and that we have to have this universal standardized metric to measure everything. This is very, very from the North coming idea that all the knowledge is universal and that there is no local knowledge, or that we don't have to be specific for the communities or the territories. And this is something that I like a lot about La Ruta del Clima, and that I want to celebrate, that they emphasize a lot in doing a lot of field work, very intense interview, visiting the communities, because every community faces loss and damages different, and the community should be the one that says how they want to approach the subject, how it should be value what they have lost or what is damaged. So we don't have to have a universal standardized metric system. We have to have a way that we can approach it fast, and that we know how to address the subject, but we don't have to have a universal standardized metric, I think, to go into loss and damages, or to try to put a value in everything, because that's, I think, is not possible to do that. And finally, another thing that I think we have to denaturalize is the idea, as you were saying, that the climate crisis affect everyone equally, because the vulnerability is a multidimensional factor that is also non-climate factors, of course. So the population have different risks created by social, economic, cultural, ethnic, gender, or the marginalization that they have, the economic. So everyone has a different risk and is very different, vulnerable to climate crisis. And we have to stop saying that climate crisis and losses and damages are for everyone, that we all facing it. Yes, of course, I face also losses and damages, but I can react different, and I have other privileges in my life that I can take care of myself if I have to face losses and damages. And this is not the same situation, especially for women in rural areas or girls that have to face losses and damages. And the third step that Casanea said that we should make is make visible. So I think that's the one that we are paying more attention to when we talk about losses and damages. We want to quantify it. We want to talk about what is getting lost, what is getting damaged. And this is, I think it's good so, but we also have to pay attention to the other two subjects and to fully understand where the problem comes. And it's a much older problem that only in the past 20 decades, or what we have been discussing in the climate agenda, is a problem that comes from the colonization and far beyond. So about the how it's affecting losses and damages in Central America, the last IPCC report, I think we all have read it, said that Central America is most likely to have a 20% precipitation reduction to 40% precipitation reduction in some areas, but also that the region is reported from tropical cyclones are projected to become more intense in the Caribbean, in the Gulf Coast of the United States, Mexico, and Central America. And this, we are talking about a region that in 2020 closes with more than 20 tropical storms and with 2 Category 4 hurricanes, Eta and Iota, that already have broke all climate records because they were both within 10 days. So it is estimated that Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua will need a decade to recover from the impacts from these 2 tropical storms. And according to the UN, Honduras alone, in Honduras alone were more than 3.7 million people affected. And in Guatemala, more of 140,000 acres of crop were damaged. Guatemala already reported in 2021, due to these 2 storms, that they have tripled the number of children with acute malnutrition. So we can see the impact of 2 storms in this very vulnerable territory has affected all the communities. So we cannot imagine what it would be if we really go past the 1.5 degrees. And we are not prepared to deal with the effects from loss and damages from the climate crisis. And we shouldn't be the one that have to pay for it as vulnerable Central American countries. The rich countries must take responsibility, and it is unacceptable that today $11 million are being given every minute to subsidize the fossil fuels, while financing for losses and damages is still lacking. So I think this is one of the main issues that we have to address, and we of course have to continue making visible the impacts from losses and damages that we face in the region, but also we have to remember the history and mark this discussion within the history of the countries that is not only as old as the climate agenda. It has a lot more history that we have to remember and also plays a role in this discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ingrid, for all that perspective. And I think just highlighting what you said, context-based and community-based assessment of loss and damage, both economic and non-economic, is something that has to be developed along with the system to report and generate data, which does not exist. And that is some of the work that, at least from La Ruta del Clima and other NGOs, are trying to work on it. And to sort of explain a little bit the efforts that we have been doing on the field lately, Adriana Vasquez from La Ruta del Clima is going to talk a little bit of our work in Central America. Go ahead, Adriana. Just 1 second, we're setting up the presentation.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm very happy to share a little about an investigation that we are doing, that we are finishing our report that we made in Central America. We worked in Costa Rica, in the coast, in the Caribbean coast, and also we made work in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And it's very related to what just Ingrid just said. We visit around, these 4 countries and 7 to 8 municipalities, and we speak with the people. We went house by house, and we went to the communities, and we saw the losses and damages that they are already suffering. It's not something that is going to happen. It's something that is already happening. And these communities is very interesting because they are very vulnerable communities that are not just affected by climate change, but also they are affected by economic and social inequality. So to share a little, I'm going to start focusing on the climate impacts related to hurricanes and storms. And then I'm going to share a little about the drought and water deficit, and also the increase of the sea level, because we visited not only communities in the coast, but also communities that are in the Canal Seco, that is like a part of Central America that is very dry, and it's very affected by climate change. And it's important in the process of consultation that we made with the communities, we start asking them when they started to realize the impacts of climate change. And most of the communities that we visit start thinking about 25 years ago, like around 1998 with Huracán Mitch. That was like the event that they, what was easy for them to remind, right? Because it was the most impactful in the last years. And what they told us was that with Hurricane Mitch, they realized that the climate was starting to change, that they were starting to see like how with that hurricane, they lost a lot of lives, like Central America was very impacted by that hurricane, and also housing and infrastructure was very affected. And some of those communities, it's crazy because it has happened already 25 years, but they still like living in the vulnerability and in the poverty caused by that hurricane 25 years ago. Because every time that they make up to recover a little, it comes another storm or another hurricane. Like Ingrid was explaining in 2020 with Hurricane Eta and Iota, it was only 10 days of separation between two events. And the communities lose everything in once, and then 10 days after, they lose again everything. So it's they never have the chance to recover completely, and when they already recovering a little, it comes another event. So that's very, with hurricanes. And here in this picture, we can see this was a storm in El Salvador, in Nejapa. It was not a hurricane, and two communities, Angelitos 1 and 2, disappeared completely because there was a landslide, sorry. Okay. Then here we see the risk management of those two communities, explaining us how the landscape took the two communities in El Salvador. And here we can see like the rest of a bridge in Guatemala, in Jupilingo, that's still in the river because the government just constructed a new bridge, but it was like 3 months after the event. So that means that those communities that depended on that bridge were uncommunicated for 3 months. And no one speaks about this because what the community says to us is that the social media is focused only in the event and not in how the communities are recovering and not the inversion that has to be done by the governments. Here we have Don Gregorio. He's from an indigenous community that is explaining us how with Eta and Iota, he lost everything in his farm because of the river. This river that is Jupilingo came out of his place. And also some of the discussion that we have with the communities was not the effect only of hurricanes and storms, but also how the productive cycle is changing. These communities that we have visited in Central America are highly dependent on agriculture, and their food is from what they produce. So in Guatemala especially, we have visited communities with higher level of malnutrition because what they produce is not producing anymore. So the corn is not growing anymore. They don't have rains when they are used to have rain. So that's how we see where they produce. It's very dry. They don't have system of water because the community don't even have like water for consumption. They depend on the rain. And here we see in El Salvador that is not only the production like agricultural, but also it is been affecting like the rivers and the sea. Like here we have a fisherman in a mangrove that is trying to take like some of the fishes, and he's telling us like we are not having fishes anymore because of the temperature of the water. The fishes that usually come there are not coming. And also with the sea level, we have been facing a lot of trouble because here is in Garita Palmera, in El Salvador, where this place that you see was a house. There was a house that was like disappeared by the rise of the sea level. And also, as I tell you before, these communities depend of the water in pounds, in pozos?
Wells.
Wells, thank you. And with the increasing of the sea level, the water gets salinized, yeah? And they don't have water to drink. And here, like this, you can see how the sea is not only increasing, but also is getting like farther in this picture, because there is in Playa Venado in Honduras, where we can also see that before the water was in this level, and right now it's very behind. And that also affects the production and the way of life of the communities. And some of the producers that are telling us that a lot of the things that they used to eat is not found anymore, and that has affections in the culture also of these communities. Because before they used to eat some kind of crabs in a specific time of the year, but right now those crabs are not coming out anymore. They told us like when the rain starts in May, all the crabs, the blue crabs coming out of their houses, and it was the moment of the year where they eat that food, but right now they are not doing that because the crabs are not living anymore in that part. So it's also an affection it's also a loss in their culture. And there are other impacts that we have to talk that are important, is on the gender side, in the human mobility, and also in the food and nutrition and the culture, as I was saying. Here we can see Doña Margarita. This is in Guatemala. And you can see this small tube, like white one. That's from where they take the water. And this picture is very important for us because what she's telling us is that when there is a dry season, instead of coming to this tube to take 5 times on the day water, they have to come 7 to 8 times. And that affects their productivity, that affects their health, that affects their security. And those are things that in this side of the world, maybe we forget because we open the tube and we have water, but they have to walk a lot of distance to get water from that small tube that you can see there. And this is something that they are already facing every day. And also, this is a group of indigenous community in Huangololo in Honduras. They're explaining us how they have to adapt their way of production to have food. But I'm not sure if we can speak like adaptation because they have to change how they produce, but that doesn't mean that their way of life is getting better, right? And to go to the next topic is human mobility. We are not speaking here about migration. We're speaking here about people is forced to leave their houses, their families, to try to find ways of surviving and not a better way of life. They are leaving everything just to see how to survive. There was a family that was telling us that after ETA and IOTA, they lose everything with the hurricanes. And the only thing that they have left was their car. So they decided to sell that car and to send both of their childs from 9 years and 11 years to the US alone, because there was the only way to ensure that they will survive and maybe have more opportunities. So when we speak about loss and damages, we are not only speaking about the economic loss and damages, we are speaking also about the effects on the social side. And some of the families that we speak with, they told us like the psychological impact that different events have had in their life is something that they can never recover. Like they can never stop being afraid when it starts to rain if they are going to lose their house, or if they are going to have a place to be safe, because also the responses of the governments are maybe not as quick as we want. So they rely on the humanitarian response that we were sharing before. And what happens if the humanitarian response doesn't arrive, right? We don't have a government that is there answering the needs of the communities. And as I said before, the chronic malnutrition and the loss of native grains that is affecting their culture, our culture, and celebrations, loss of dishes that they used to eat. In Costa Rica, in the Caribbean, they told us about an alga,
Algae.
that before used to grow in the Caribbean, and right now, because of the change of the temperature of the water, they don't have it anymore. And that's also a dish that was specific from that part of the country that we are not having the opportunity to test, to try. And some of the reflections that we have, have about this process is that all these events are accumulative and have impacts on the vulnerability and inequality of these communities. There are communities that already are suffering, and it's very difficult for them to recover. And also, I think we cannot speak only from our position of privilege, because also we get affected by these loss and damages as country. We are not having the chance to try the food. That's very simple. But also the growth of the economy is affected, because if we have a lot of people that is migrating, and we have a lot of people that is that has to stop working because they lost everything, that affects our economy and the growth and the development of our countries. And I think also it's important to put in the table that we have very absent states in the response of the effects of climate change. And I'm not sure if it's because of the lack of resources, or if it's because we have a lot of political issues as countries that we have to tackle also. But the states are not opening spaces for us as citizens to participate and to raise the voice and to say, hey, we need an answer and we need actions to all these problems that we are facing. And some things that it's important also to put in the table is that there's a lot of humanitarian leaderships in these communities. All these people that you saw in the pictures is people that it's involved in a certain way in their community to adapt, to make changes, to take care of their environment, and they have a very basic level of knowledge, but they have a lot of commitment in what they are doing. And right now they rely in humanitarian cooperation. So also I think that's important to put on the table. And I think that's it. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Adriana. And to highlight also a comment that you made that applies to here is that silence, that absence of our own governments to not draw a line, to at least have an agenda item of loss and damage, costs people's lives, impacts human rights. and the fact that developed countries also systematically object to have an adequate response to loss and damage, that is also part of the problem, and it is what these people are facing every day, and that's what they're praying for. And that's something that we cannot forget. And now our next speaker are gonna take us from Central America all the way to the south, to Argentina, and Nasha Cubelier from Sustentabilidad Sin Fronteras. And I hope you're there online, Nasha?
Hi, Adrian. How are you? Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you for your leadership to La Ruta del Clima that you're doing loss and damages. For us, it's very important and inspiring. We are an NGO dedicated to climate change, and so far only on mitigation, adaptation, and awareness. But I'm more and more concerned about the impacts that our country is already facing. And I would like to share with you some of the last extreme climate events we had in our country. So I do have a small presentation. I don't know if you are having the presentation right now, or I can share my screen too.
If you can share it, go ahead.
If I can share, okay, yeah, no problem. So just 1 minute. So I would like to start with this first slide. So are you watching my presentation now? Yeah, okay, great. So I would like to start with this event because maybe you already know, Argentina is a really large country with a lot of ecosystems. We have rainforests and glaciers and coastal cities and mountains and even a desert in the center of the country somehow. So each environment has really different kind of climate extreme events. And in some regions, they have 1 year flooding and the next year fires, or the lack of rainfalls. So it's really intense the way of how climate events are really going deep into the roots of communities and economies and social losses, etc. Something that is really alarming is that there are no record of what is happening in our country, nor by the government, nor by other NGOs, nor by no one is recording what's happening in terms of climate change related impacts. So all we have are some journalists having a coverage that usually is more related to the short-term impacts and not the middle-term or long-term impacts. And this is I'm going to quickly give you an overview of what happened in the last years. So in 2019, we had an extreme flooding. 100 were evacuated and 1.5 million productive hectares were affected, and an estimated of $11 million was lost due to the flooding. But this is only just in the short term, all right? Because we are not talking about, as Adriana said, what happened to those families? Where did they go? What happened with their communities, practices, culture, etc., right? So in 2020, we had a really hot summer, and we had more than 74,000 active outbreaks. So that's more than double than the previous year. And it was the third largest year with fires going on all around the country during the summer. But 2022 was again a record, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it later. So really we had a fire emergency that affected like a lot of hectares, but something important is also the ecosystem and the biodiversity was affected. So ecosystem loses their resilience, and we have the loss of a lot of species that are endangered, really lose some of the key places in their ecosystems to feed themselves, to have a safety for their calves, etc. So the impacts on biodiversity are really not being covered by the government or a program or loss and damages policies that are totally unexhausted. So in 2020, we also started the historical drop in our main river, commercial river. So important, goes from Brazil to the port of Buenos Aires, and is one of the main navigated rivers in our country. And it costed the economy at least, and so far, $244 million due to the strong impact on the agri-industrial system. So we are mainly an agri-industrial export, and many agriculture lands were not able to sell their crops, and this impacted more the small producers, because big producers had the opportunity to come together and pay really big trucks that use the main roads and to find alternatives. But many they simply had to let their crops be there and then be wasted. And this is a really huge loss on food. And there was absolutely nothing that you could do about it. And this was due to just the lack of our main navigated river. And this summer, we had a really strong heat wave of the South American country. But in Buenos Aires, more than 80,000 families, well, here it says 72, but there were more than 80,000 families that stayed without electricity. So this is the drama, right? When we have heat waves or extreme cool days, there is a demand for energy from big cities that are more and more crowded that the system cannot supply. So we have electricity shortcuts. And when this happens, those who suffer the most are, of course, those who live in a very precarious type of houses, and they have no current water. So imagine a heat wave without electricity and without current water to drink. So people were forced to sleep outside on the street and walk around, find bars that might be able to help them and give them some water. So it was like a super extreme conditions for the streets of Buenos Aires in the most vulnerable neighborhoods. And of course, the government was not ready for this kind of events, and they are not ready. None of us are ready for this kind of electricity shortcuts. And actually is related with the burning of fossil fuels, right? Because our energy matrix is still very much related to burning fossil fuels. And heat waves really affect the infrastructure that is needed to have electricity based on fossil fuels. So if we had a more renewable matrix energy, we could also face shortcuts like this that we had during the summer. And so I'm going to start closing, but this summer we had the opportunity to travel to Villa La Angostura. This is a really small community, like a city of 20,000 people surrounded by the Nahuel Huapi, which is inside a natural park. So it is supposed to have more conservative practices, but I say supposed to because you have a lot of ski stations and you have a lot of exotic species going inside the territory. And not they have a lot of environmental hazards like water pollution, deforestation, waste management, and decreasing of rainfalls. So there is also really something interesting is that there is like an extremely unequal society, because you have really super rich people having their winter houses in Villa Langostura where they go to ski or have other winter sports. And at the same time, you have a really poor community. Many of them come from indigenous communities that were displaced, and they started working for tourism there, and they live really like in super poor conditions, and they serve tourism, but climate change impacts are already there. So for example, there was a lack of snow that really affected all the winter sports. So people didn't went there to have their normal winter sports. And all of those people, and especially the whole community, did not have the possibility to work that winter. So they had to wait until the next summer when the summer sports and vacations came of tourism to have some incomes. So these are like impacts that are affecting, of course, as Adriana said, and all of you, the most vulnerable. But to find who are the most vulnerable, what are their characteristics, what are they losing regarding going beyond the extreme event and the short-term impacts like houses, hectares, or food, or lives. We have to measure this, we have to record this, but also to look at the middle-term and long-term impacts on the communities and our countries. So hope this might be helpful to go on with the conversation. This was a quick overview of a little bit what is happening in my country, the things we would like to see, and maybe to explain why we want and we need a loss and damage policy, a loss and damage fund. We need to better work close with communities to better understand what are they losing and how are being affected by climate change. So thank you very much for your time in the space and the opportunity to share. And I'm more than open to questions if they are after.
Thank you, Nasha. And before I open the floor for questions, and there Natalia is going to help us out with the microphone. One of the things that we also know is that we don't really know what's going on in terms of data in our communities on loss and damage. Even though we feel it and we can go and talk with communities as Nasha was studying, and Ingrid and Adriana, and even Nafkote was telling us about that in other communities, we cannot compare. And we are going to publish a summary of NDC information on loss and damage. And what we can tell about that in our region in Latin America is that not only there's no continuity between one updated NDC from the first one, is that there's no way to compare. So we cannot say if it is getting worse or if it is getting better, or if the government is just updating the data that they had before or where the data came from. All we have is the stories of what is actually happening in the ground. And from what we know and what we live, loss and damage is there. So as that is the reality, and that's what the IPCC is also telling us. And despite not having information from the government, and despite not having an actual functional response from the UNFCCC on loss and damage that allow us to have a systemic assessment and a systemic response, this is the information that we have, and this is the fight that we're starting on from the community perspective on loss and damage. And now I would love to open the floor for you to ask any questions to these panelists that we have today. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. And please do, because we have lots of time.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you want to make a comment also, that's okay.
Yeah, it's a question. Hi, My name's Tracy. I'm from OXFAM, and I'm not about to ask the OXFAM panelist a question. I can do that after. But no, my question, in terms of the region, it'd be really good to just get a top-level flavour of kind of, awareness of climate change, awareness of these impacts that are being experienced. To what extent is it in the public consciousness that this is linked to climate change? I mean, you touched on it in the presentations, but it'd be good to hear more on that. And also, what is the state of mobilization and people calling to account their own governments and thinking more widely, globally, in terms of what action's needed? Just getting a sense of the overall kind of picture on that would be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure if I can give you the best answer. During our research, we didn't focus a lot on mobilization of the people. We were mapping all the losses and damages in general, but the mobilization came out as a problem, as a topic. And in general, what they told us is in the 3 countries that we visit, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, it was that a lot of communities have been forced to move from other places, not only the US, but especially the US, but they are forced to move because they lost their way of production, they lost their houses, they lost their communities, and the people who are moving more are especially children and men. Women stay in the community. So in Honduras, they told us that there's communities that are only women and children because all the men move to the US trying to find the way to generate income for the households. And I think something important to say is that the effect is not only that the people is moving and that the families are breaking, it's also the thing that they are not sure if the family member is going to arrive to the US. And in some of the cases, they never know if that person is going to come back. And all the effects, psychological effects that they told us, that's something that they will never recover. That's something that is never going to be repaired, like the loss of that family member. In the case of this family that both of their child moved to the US, the mother cried for 1 year every day because she was not sure if they were going to be okay. After 6 months, they knew that they arrived well, but they feel guilty of sending them to the US. And I think that's something that we are not talking. That's something that we are not saying. And from the north, what they see is that they are receiving a lot of migrants, but they are not seeing what's happening in the communities. And it's something that we have to map also. And about the second part of the action of the governments and what the communities are doing, these communities were in very vulnerable areas, so they are not speaking up in front of the governments. Maybe they go to the municipalities, like the local governments, but in a broad level, they don't do it. And I think it's because they don't have the means, they don't know where to go, and what in Guatemala they told us is that even if they knock to that door, they won't have an answer. Because in some of the countries, the government sometimes change the data in a way maybe doesn't show the reality of what is happening in the communities. Maybe because, I don't know if it's because they don't have the resources or because they want to show a better face than what is really happening in the ground. So in some of the places that we visited, the municipality and some of the representative of institutions were there speaking with us, open to share. But in some of the countries, we didn't receive any answer, even if we asked for a meeting just to know what were their loss and damages. So I think that's also showing us, like the absence of a data, it's a data. Like they are also saying to us, we don't have to share what is happening. And that showed that the participation space is each time more close to some persons, and sometimes as NGOs, we are not very well received because we are going to say, hey, you need to do something and you're not doing it, right? Yeah.
Also, if there is any of the panelists online that would like to answer, that's always open. If not, then if there's another...
Hi, Adrian.
Go ahead, Ingrid.
Well, I wanted to just complement that from January to November 2021, according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection statistic, more than 733,000 people from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador have been intercepted at the border. And Salvadorian people were around 100,000. So the rise in migration from the cold triangle from Central America has never been reported in the past century. And according to the records from the Department of Homeland Security, what these people had in common when they were asked why they were migrating, they all said that they have lost their homes due to Eta Niñota. So due to Eta Niñota, the two hurricanes in 2020, around 6.8 million people lose their whole house and livelihood, and now they are, of course, migrating to adapt to the situation that they have lost everything and they have to move. So there is this statistic only from the Custom Border Protection and how much they are being returned, but we don't actually have a statistic of how many arrive in the US. And so it's really, we have a lack of data. OXFAM also has a report in 2019 with data that says that almost 20 million people are displaced due to climate change in the region. So, and also La Cruz Roja, the Red Cross, is trying to document the mobilization of Central American people due to climate change. And they said in 2020, like 1.5 million people were displaced due to climate change disasters in Honduras and in Guatemala and Nicaragua, also during the Eta Niñota hurricane. So the data is really alarming, and it's scary to see how many people have to move and mobilize to adapt. So we also we have to ask for loss and damages, but we also have to work for a convention or for the marco legal, for the laws that, for the legal frame, thank you, Adrian, that protect the people that have to mobilize due to climate crisis. And they have to also be able to come to America or to the other countries that are able, that are responsible for the climate crisis and ask for refugee. And this is not something to alarm the other countries so that they think there is this millions of people coming. I mean, migration is a human right, and so it should be protected, and the people that have to move due to the climate crisis should also be protected. So
thank you, Ingrid.
We maybe just to say that we try not to talk that much about the numbers because it's really alarming, and most of the people from the countries that are receiving the migrants or the people that is mobilizing, they get scared when they hear these numbers, and they can tend to promote phobia or racism or discrimination to the people that have to move. So but the numbers are being produced in some extent by these organizations.
And I think just to follow up with what Ingrid says, this shows the structural violence that loss and damage is forcing these communities. On one hand, you have the human right to human mobility and to find safeguard to your life and to have climate refugee status, but on the other hand, you have no financial response, no agenda item on loss and damage, and also you have, of course, the phrase that I can never forget, "Don't come," from Kamala Harris when talking about migration in Central America. So that's basically what these communities have received. Just stay there and endure and pay it yourself. And that's basically the message that is coming out of these holes, and that communities receive, even if they don't know the word loss and damage when they face the impacts of climate change. Another question in the back?
Thank you. Thank you for a really interesting discussion. My question is actually linked to what you've just been talking about with climate refugees. And obviously, because they aren't recognized in law, I was wondering if you could expand a bit about your work on how that impacts people who are trying to migrate, and also if that migration occurs within Latin America itself, or is it like primarily just like northwards? Thank you.
I think, Ingrid, you could also talk about that, so I don't want to take the space from you. Go ahead.
So from the Heinrich Boll Foundation, we are working in a recomendable for the Central American governments, so that they can ask and demand for a protective system for the people that have to migrate. Honduras is right now asking for the Central America's countries to go together and to try to work in a common regulation for migration that has in the center the people that have to move due to climate change. So I think this is going to move forward in the next years in Central America, at least, is that topic. If you talk about climate change, the climate migration is the one thing that everyone wants to focus on, and is the one that most people are relate to directly. As someone in the family had to move due to climate crisis, so it's something that is very relatable. And how it's moving forward was the question. Help me. ¿Cuál era la pregunta, Adrián? What was the question again?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've kind of answered most of it, but like, because they're not recognized, how does that affect their experience of like migrating?
Well, it doesn't set them apart from the rest of the people that migrate due to other reasons. I mean, migration is very complex to define, and all the reasons mixed together, but they don't have any protection. So there is not really a different answer for anyone that is migrating or mobilizing within Central America or to America, if they're mobilizing due to climate crisis or due to another situation that they are facing. Most of the people migrate to the north, but also there is a bit of migration to the US, I mean, but there is also migration to Mexico, to Colombia, to Costa Rica, to Panama. And it depends now if, for example, Nicaragua, they go to Costa Rica mostly right now because it's more accessible. And Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, they move together to the north, mostly to Mexico and to the United States, in the hopes that they can go in and remain in the country. But as Adrián and Adriana said, that they really risk their life in the process, and there is no way to apply for a refugee or asilo if you are really facing this climate crisis or losses and damages due to the climate crisis.
And maybe to complement Ingrid's comment, and later I give you the mic. We have a book on human mobility. It's in Spanish though. And the basic is the same. Human mobility in the context of climate change is just as loss and damage. Has no real definition, is not properly addressed by the UN system, is addressed nationally and by separate different UN bodies with different definitions themselves. So it's part of this systemic violence against the effect of climate change that people face. And just to answer, if you have no basis to be received as a refugee because developed countries consider that it's too hard to expand the definition of what it is a refugee to include people that are affected in the context of climate change, then you're not welcome in the country of destination. And that is basically the main impact of not having discussions on loss and damage and not having it even if it's just addressed under the whim in a tax for not having an address at the COP, this is the sort of effect that legally people have, even when you start breaking down the issue of loss and damage, for example, in terms of human mobility, and being able to find a place to safeguard your guard and cross borders as it is your human right to do so, so you don't die. And person on the back, please. Oh, go ahead, yeah. And
Sorry, I just wanted to say something on migration. I think really important to know that a lot of the displacement is internal displacement. Unless people are desperate, they do not want to go, cross the border and go to the US or Australia. So this idea of, climate migration, climate refugee, I don't know how to say it politically, in a politically correct way, but we have to be careful and, not to sensationalize it. When we say, every year 20 million people get displaced, the majority is internally displaced. So I think Ingrid was talking earlier about that we have to be careful the way we measure things. And when we talk about loss and damage, like it's so hard to measure the trauma and the desperation. So again, unless people have exhausted everything, within their power to cope, they would not want to migrate to other places. So that's why countries and communities need finance so that they can adapt, so that they can rebuild. Thank you.
And those that can cross borders or move within their towns are like the women that Adriana mentioned, that they just stay in the dangerous place and get left behind. Now you, the person on the back, I'm sorry. Huh? Okay, then let's do those. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Marissa Hutchinson. I am the Environmental Justice Program Officer with the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, also known as ERA AP. But I'm also speaking today from very personal experience. So I was happy when our colleague who spoke about Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Honduras made mention of the Caribbean, but I'm more directly from the Caribbean island of Barbados. And the impact of climate change for us as islands is just as significant as Guatemala and Honduras, etc. But I wanted to speak to human mobility, but also internal displacements, as you started to add. In the case of the Caribbean, it gets difficult, whereas we're islands, because of where we're situated, etc. So there's the displacement, yes, there's migration, but we try. Is double that. So a lot of times, again, it's hard for persons to migrate, especially when we're migrating in most cases upward to the north, to the US and to Canada, and it's hard for us to already enter because of other situations, not just climate change, and climate change not being as important for them, whereas there's like persons seeking refugee status for cases of gender-based violence or, homophobia, etc. So it makes it even more difficult for us to migrate. And then when you think about economies, etc., we are tourist destinations for many, but our economy for us as nationals is less than most persons earn. So in terms of migrating, whereas there's not a system in place that provides migration for us, it's really hard for persons like nationals to migrate. And that then also just facing many systemic barriers when we enter borders is another issue. And then that makes it even harder for us to migrate. And in the case where it was interesting to hear you say that men and children often migrate, because in our case in the Caribbean, it's often women and children, and men are left behind to, build back. That's the main thing. But also then too, there's the other thing where people, again, aren't able to migrate. And when these people are left or trying to figure it out, is women who focus on recovery, and that's where the burden comes, and then you see the same impacts of mental and physical health, etc. So yeah, I just wanted to add that, but definitely internal displacement where we're very small islands, again, Barbados especially, so we don't have like hills and mountains, etc., but we do still have landslides, and we still have those similar impacts. But again, it's like, how do we ensure that governments, and I mean, everyone probably thinks that our Prime Minister is doing a great job, and she's very new to being a prime minister, even though she's in her second term. But however, how do we then as a Caribbean, as a region, get these leaders to come together and really decide that, yes, there needs to be more finance here and we need to push harder. I think in many ways, we're not as strong as the Pacific, but I always say to colleagues that we have to just jump on board the Pacific and learn so much from them, but also the Pacific is struggling. So then where do we really come together and really make a decision that we have to really bang on the heads of world leaders and say, this is how we move forward. And climate finance is a huge part of that.
And I promised the person on the back on the left 4 times. and I think that's probably the last question because we only have 10 more minutes, but let's see.
Hi everyone, Jean-Baptiste from Canla. Just 2 or 3 comments maybe to complement some of the elements. First, on the big picture, also I guess what is important is to have a look to the all regions. And if you see country by country, there is always a big problem about climate impacts. You see Chile, you know what is the problem about water. You see Argentina, the same. Nasha explained it very well. If you come to Central America, the same. Also, ETA and IOTA went through a part of Colombia. There is no part of a Latin American country and a Caribbean country that is not affected by loss and damage and climate impact. Second point might be in the medium scale, one of the things that we should think and take advantage to is the Escazú agreement to link the human rights pledge and the loss and damage pledge that we have is something essential to be able to work on, especially you're working for other regions. It's important to have this look and to be able to make the linkage with the Escazú agreement to be able to fight climate change and climate impacts and loss and damage. Last thing, also, it's to give some more example about the impact and about migration. For example, I've been part of some process in Nicaragua that from the ground to we dig to get some information and about a migration. If some people get out of the territory, some people might need to go back to the territory. Young people that are studying at the university will stop their study to be back in the community, to be able to work, to also all people in the community might need to go back to work and to do the agriculture work on the field. Also, it's an impact, and don't even think about the young children that are left by their parents, and they don't have their parents for 5, 10, we don't know how many years. It's also a loss that everybody can understand. And so, thank you very much.
I think we have maybe one intervention of very short. You go ahead, and then with that we will close.
Okay, I have a question.
It's okay.
I mean, you can answer afterwards, Adrian, but I really, the point you made about data really resonated, because it's very hard to do advocacy, to really fight for legislation that we need, actions, policies without data. And this is something that we're seeing across regions. This is gap in data. But another thing is, one, we're seeing the data is not existing in many places, so there's that. But then also how official data is collected, which I think you mentioned, does not always work in the context of loss and damage in particular, because it is not just, they often give it to consulting companies like Deloitte or KPMG, and loss and damage, especially non-economic loss and damage, is so context particular that community-led data collection is even more important. So I guess my question is, I know Ruta del Clima has been doing fantastic work on thinking around some of this. What are some of the solutions that you see in addressing this data gap and really kind of foregrounding community narratives that you've uplifted so beautifully, but foregrounding that in a way that is accepted officially and is acted upon? Thanks, Adrian.
Okay, I'll try to answer it, and if any of you want to complement, that would be cool in 6 minutes. So I think one of the first things that we have to do is to include in our narrative is that it has to be, data has to be context-based and community-led. That is something that we have to put as a standard demand from the NGO side. It cannot be just like they do in, like we were talking back in Costa Rica with a person from the National Community Steering Emergency. Basically what they do is they take a tour after a disaster and write down how many bridges, how many houses, and check. That's sort of, then they do the math, and that's a number. That cannot happen with loss and damage, because you cannot put all the different issues that are there and long-term issues, because loss and damage endures beyond just an event. Not only because of slow onset, but of the ramifications of the impacts of loss and damage. You were talking about psychological, cultural loss, identity loss, are things that go beyond that. And I mean, for example, some solutions I've read about, like let's put a museum or something like that. Yeah, okay, sure. But it's very complex. So you need at least to acknowledge the complexity and acknowledge that there has to be a process. It has to be a standardized process from a diverse source. And that's sort of also what Ingrid was saying. It cannot be just like a broad number, but it has to be a process also to validate what is and what may not be loss and damage and how much it is. And then it's things that we have already talked to, and even OASIS in the past decades ago have talked about how could we do this, and it's something that we have already done in the UNFCCC, have these talks, and there have been proposals of how to assign funding and how to assess this and how to distribute it and how to prioritize it. But it's something that we should be doing since we already have an article in an international agreement on climate change on loss and damage, but since we do not address it properly within the UNFCCC, we don't have these conversations ever. So from our side, we don't have the solutions. We know where to point it, but if we want the solutions, we have to go and talk about them. And that is what we're unable to do in this forum. And I don't know if any of you want to add something about this?
Maybe, I think the challenge is not just how to measure, is how to collect it. Because this conversation was 2-hour conversation with a group, like with different groups. And it was at the end of that conversation when they start to have trust in the person that is asking, that they start pointing those other aspects that are maybe not measurable and that are more social and yeah, I think that's something that we have to figure out as organizations and as a society. Like, it's important to show up that when there is mobilization, there is loss of languages, there is loss of culture, that when they start cooking something, it's important, because people might say, like, that's not important, that's not economic, but it has an impact, and it's this impact and this loss is something that we have to find a way to put in a paper and to give it the importance that it has. Because for them as communities, it's important. And I think we have to put always the community and the people in the center of this discussion and not only the economic aspect.
Maybe the colleague from Argentina might have actually a better suggestion for this, but I wanted to give you quickly an example. You know, the US research that was released recently says 43% of, you know, it's talking about the Southwest drought, like mega drought, yeah, the US is going through. But they have this attribution thing. They were able to state clearly 43% of the crisis was caused by human-induced climate change. So I wanted us to do the same thing. Can we do that for Horn of Africa? Can we specifically say, you know, human-induced climate change caused this drought by this amount? They said there's no data available. You need, I don't know, some vegetation measurement and then in the atmosphere. I don't know how it works, but that shows you how we're like way behind, yeah? So for that, I think, as Adrian said, one is within this system, we really need to push forward, like through the Santiago network, through like this finance discussion. We need to say, you know, for developing countries, we need to provide support, technical support, so that they can do this. That's one, so at this level. But at national levels, there are countries, for instance, I'm from Ethiopia. Like Ethiopia throughout, you know, I don't know, in the past 30, 40 years, because of, you know, repeated droughts, they have created a system where they can collect data from community, like from the lowest level to regional, I think there's even another level, and then to the federal level. So that really helps, you know, collect the data in a way that reflects what's on the ground, and it's different from region to region. But they need money, huge finance. So it always goes back to money. But we also need to keep our governments accountable, saying, hey, you need to collect data, you know, from the, how do you say, from bottom up. So that system also needs to exist. So we need to push at national level. We also need to push at UNFCCC level.
And on that note, I want to thank all the panelists and all the audience for joining us. It has been a very interesting conversation, and hopefully it helped us out in our advocacy efforts. And thank you for coming, and have a great night or evening or afternoon. Goodbye.